The Extraordinary Phenomenon Investigations Council presents Epic Voyages. Come join us as we enter and experience the great mysteries of the world with tonight's host,
William Puckett.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the weekly Epic Voyagers radio show. We got a great show planned tonight. My name is William Puckett. I'll be hosting the show tonight. I'm the lead investigator for Epic. I was just appointed to that post a couple weeks ago, and I'm also manage my own UFO investigation website, which is UFOs Northwest. I'll be giving the website out for that and the Epic website later on in the show. Tonight we got two great guests lined up. First guest, Mack Maloney from the Boston area, is going to be talking about his new book, UFOs in Wartime. He's written several books and has an outstanding biography. You can read about Mack on my site, www.ufosnw.com, and just click on the top of the page where it has some information about tonight's show. Our second guest will be Bradford Evans. Bradford and I have worked together investigating UFOs for years. Bradford has a great background in psychology. He's interviewed a lot of witnesses for me and produced a lot of outstanding reports. He'll also be discussing his upcoming book. After that, time permits, towards the end of the first hour, we may take some calls or some chat room messages. I may discuss some newer cases on my site. And then the second half of the show, the last 30 minutes, will be dedicated mostly to taking your calls and trying to answer questions. This is William Puckett again, if you just joined us, from the high mountain valleys of the capital city of Helena, Montana. And with that, we're going to bring on our first guest, Mack Maloney. Mack is a journalist in the Boston area. He's an author of over 30 books. And the most interesting part of Mack is that he is a journalist and he's developed an interest in the UFO phenomenon. It's always good to see different disciplines cover the field of UFOs. And with that, we'll be bringing Mack on, and Mack will be talking about his book, and we'll be going through a few other issues. Mack, are you there?
Yes, I am, Bill.
Hi, good evening. How are things in Boston tonight?
We're doing pretty good. It's a little cold here, but, we're kind of used to that in the middle of January.
Absolutely. Well, we don't have any snow here yet, but we're supposed to get some in the next couple of days.
Neither do we, and that's okay. That's fine with us.
Right. Well, Mack, you and I have a few things in common. First off, we're both our fathers were World War II veterans. My dad was a member of the 8th Air Force and was in Europe and Northern Africa and always wanted to fly an airplane, but his eyesight wasn't quite good enough. So, tell us about your how you got interested in UFOs and what led you to publish this most recent book, UFOs in Wartime.
Well, I've always had an interest in UFOs. Even as a kid, I used to just read anything I could get my hands on about UFOs. I was fascinated with them, for as long as I can remember. And then, as you mentioned, my father was also a World War II veteran. He was in the South Pacific on a Navy ship for 4 years. And he was also into military history. So when I was growing up, he had a lot of military books around the house, and just as a kid, I would pick them up and read them, or sometimes just look at the pictures, and I just did this for years and years, and so I kind of developed a interest in military history myself, and at some point, these two things kind of just crossed paths. I was actually, it was about 3 years ago, I was having lunch with my editor one day, and we were just throwing around ideas, and I mentioned to him that, it seems that UFOs, the UFO sightings go up, or they seem to spike when during wartime, or actually, and also when we're, let's say, getting prepared for war. And he said, that might not be a bad idea for a book, but it would have to be a nonfiction book. And I've written over 30 books, but they've all been novels, military novels, and a few science fiction novels mixed in. So I said, well, that might be interesting. So that was about 3 years ago, and here we are. The book came out about a month ago.
Right. Let me ask you this: in any of the military information that you read, did you read anything about the Foo Fighters that you're talking about in your book, and any of your dad's logs or anything? I know my father had some logs, and I've never looked at them, but just curious to know if you come across any of that in reading your dad's materials.
No. I wasn't familiar with Foo Fighters until maybe about 20 years ago that I, first read something about it, or I saw it in a book or whatever, and there really wasn't that much about Foo Fighters until a few years ago. An author named Keith Chester wrote a book called Strange Company, and it's really the definitive book on Foo Fighters, and he and I became sort of like friends while I was researching my book. We talked on the phone a bunch of times and exchanged a lot of emails, and we relied on his book a lot for the section in our book on Foo Fighters. And he really uncovered a lot about Foo Fighters, not only in Europe, but also during the Pacific Theater. But to answer your question, I don't think my father ever, if my father saw a UFO during World War II, he never mentioned it to me. Let me put it that way.
Right. Yeah. These Foo Fighters, the interesting thing about them is that, after World War II, when Nazi pilots and Allied pilots and Japanese pilots, they all thought that each side had these secret weapons, and they found out, no, they weren't yours, and they weren't ours. Well, I guess that kind of eliminates, where they came from. And certainly, from what I understand, and I've actually read a few personal accounts of Foo Fighters, they definitely were unidentified. But according to your book, that wasn't the first appearance of UFOs on the war front. Apparently, there were sightings in World War I. Is that correct?
Yes, there was. The book really takes up most of the book goes from the beginning of the 20th century to right up to the end of the First Gulf War. So we cover most of the 20th century, and what we found out was the first real, let's say, outbreak of quote-unquote UFOs was in 1909. Before World War II even started, with the scare ships, which were objects that people thought were Zeppelins at first, but they're actually spotted going over England at speeds up to 200 and 250 miles an hour. Very strange story. The whole idea of the whole story behind the scare ships is a very kind of a weird story. But then in World War I, we have a story in there in which a pilot was flying above London in 1914. Kind of like a early warning systems for Zeppelins that were bombing UK at that point, and he saw this very strange object that wasn't a Zeppelin. His description was more like the famous cigar-shaped object that we hear a lot about in UFOs. He actually shot at this thing with his pistol. He wasn't armed. His plane wasn't armed, but he was armed with a pistol, and he shot at this thing, and it took off at tremendous speed. And we think that he was probably the first person ever to shoot at a UFO in flight. And there were UFOs seen over the trenches of World War I. There's the famous kind of fable about the angels of Mons, where people swear they saw huge angels with bows and arrows fighting on the side of the British against the Germans. And then there was the very odd occurrences in Portugal at Fatima that have a religious bent to them. But if you really read it, it actually seems like some kind of a UFO sighting. So World War I was actually a time where a lot of people were seeing a lot of strange things in the sky.
Yeah, that I've heard that too. That the Fatima sighting could have very well been a UFO sighting, and that was seen by a lot of people. And you mentioned shooting at a UFO. I've had a group of witnesses in Missouri along the Mississippi River that took a shot at a UFO. They were in boats, and this thing shut down all their boats when they shot at it and just disappeared. It was a huge green light. Very enigmatic sighting, but really strange. So I'm not sure I'd want to shoot at one, but definitely superior technology. And I guess we're lucky that they don't, so far at least, I haven't heard of them shooting back. Let me ask you, Mack, I'm kind of looking at your talking points out of your book, and I'm familiar with this. The 1947... the Air Force asked its Air Technical Intelligence Center to determine if UFOs existed. I believe that was a Project Sign, and my recollection, and you've covered this in your book, is that the conclusion of Project Sign was that UFOs were extraterrestrial, and then the Pentagon said, no, that's the wrong answer, and they sent it back and say, no, we want a better explanation. And my understanding is that Edward Ruppelt, the first director of Blue Book, and also Dr. J. Allen Hynek were privy to that information. So anyhow, what do you know about that particular incident?
Well, you're right. They in 1947, when there was just this deluge of UFO sightings over the United States after Kenneth Arnold made his sighting, the sighting which led to the term flying saucers being used. People just started seeing flying saucers everywhere over the U.S., and of course the military, especially the Air Force, they felt that that what they had to do was to find out whether these things were, number one, were they real, and were they secret weapons, let's say, sent over here by the Soviet Union. So they gave this mission to the A.T.I.C., which were very highly respected scientists and engineers, to look into this, and they came back with their report, and they said that UFOs, they were called flying saucers at the time, were real. What people were seeing were real. They weren't hallucinations. They weren't delusions and things of this nature. People were actually seeing something, and it didn't seem to be any technology that was of this earth. But what happened was, when they made this report to the Pentagon, as you said, it wasn't the answer the Pentagon wanted to hear. So they told them to basically go reinvestigate it, and the people at the A.T.I.C., kind of got the message and did like another study, let's say, and came back and said, oh, well, it turns out that UFOs are just basically either people committing a hoax, or the reports are made by delusional people, or the hallucinations and things like that. So what happened really was, in 1947, we really did have the chance to look into UFOs in a stable, sober, scientific way, and but the U.S. military saw things in a different way, and that's really when the cover-up of UFOs by the U.S. military started, and it continues today. That's correct.
Not too long after that, I don't know the year and the actual date, but the famous Cutler Twining memo, General Nathan Twining, I believe he later became a chief of staff. He talked that the phenomenon was real and not a delusionary, and that was a pretty strong statement, but it kind of conflicted with the A.T.I.C. report. I've actually got a copy of Project Sign with the altered report, where they said, like you said, they were hoaxes or delusions or other explainable phenomena. And then it went on with the Robertson panel in 1953, where the CIA spent an afternoon debunking UFOs, and then the first Project Blue Book Special Report 14, where the Battelle Corporation actually did a chi-square statistical analysis and concluded that the higher quality of the sighting, the more unknown it was. And then the Air Force put a special report out opposite that, trying to say that only 3% of the sightings were unidentified, yet the actual body of the report said it was 20%. So, like you say, the cover-up continues. First off, your book is available on Amazon.com, right? Is that correct, Mac?
Yes, Amazon.com. It's published by Penguin Books, so it's available at every bookstore across the country.
Okay,
but it's also available at Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com, and like I said, well, the publisher always wants me to mention that you can go to your local bookstore and buy it too.
Right. So, listeners, you can obtain a copy of Mac's book, any of those locations. Well, I look at interest here, Mac, on your talking point from your book, and you say the book debunks the Roswell incident, and of course that's kind of the holy grail of a lot of ufologists. One came down in that summer of 1947 with all those reports. So why don't you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I was always a big fan of Roswell. I will say that when I was reading books as a kid in the 50s and 60s about UFOs, Roswell was never mentioned. Roswell doesn't come into UFO literature until the late 70s and 80s, and I think that's due to Stan Friedman and other people. But the more I looked into it, and looked into the current literature, and then I just looked at the pictures that were released after the press release went out that said that the Air Force said, or the AAF had found this saucer crash debris. I think everyone knows now that at the same time the U.S. government had this spy balloon project going on where they would send these huge balloons over the Soviet Union with listening devices attached to them, and to see whether the Russians had the atomic bomb or not, trying to find out acoustically whether they could detect explosions. So these huge spy balloons had tails, almost like kite tails, and when you see the debris that was in the pictures from Roswell, and then you see one of these kite tails from these spy balloons, you can match them up almost piece by piece. And so, there was a cover-up, and what the cover-up was not that a flying saucer had crashed, but that they were covering up that they had this spy balloon project going on. And then you kind of take that a little bit further, and you see now that the current literature, or some of the current literature, is that, that is actually, a dozen flying saucers that crashed there, and there were dozens of bodies, and all these people involved. And just to me, it just seems like too many moving parts or something for this to be true. So, for me, I'm not saying that, that there wasn't some flying saucers crashed and recovered from other parts of the world or other parts of the U.S., and maybe, they have pieces of that or whatever, but I just don't believe that anything happened in Roswell.
Yeah, that definitely is an enigma. Like you said, the Roswell story didn't come out. I mean, it hit a lot of newspapers at the time, and then as soon as the Air Force said it was a weather balloon, it stopped it until Stanton Friedman found Jesse Marcel in New Orleans, and Jesse Marcel talked about it. The problem with Roswell is, it happened so many years ago, and then there's been a lot of witnesses that have been proven to be pranksters, and even the official government accounting office report that the under the direction of, or requested, Stephen Schiff, who was a local congressman at the time. Tragically, he died not too long after that of skin cancer, but the government accounting office said that all the records had been destroyed. That doesn't mean it was a UFO. It just means it's pretty difficult to really say what it was. But yeah, there's been a lot of spin-offs, stories from Roswell, and it's we really may never know what happened, but I've never ever seen any evidence that it was extraterrestrial. Of course, here in Helena, Jesse Marcel Jr., retired physician, still lives here. I haven't had a chance to catch up with him yet, but he lives here, and he was 11 years old at the time, and of course he handled some of the debris. So anyhow, yeah, it's interesting getting your perspective on that. Also, you mentioned recently, apparently, the online petition to the White House asking President Barack Obama if he was aware of any contact the U.S. government had with extraterrestrials. Go ahead and elaborate on that.
Well, right, that happened, just recently, where they got a petition together, and I think they had 25,000 people sign it. It was an online petition, and basically what they were asking the Obama administration is, do you have any evidence that the U.S. government has been in contact with extraterrestrials? And as a result, a kind of low-level or mid-level scientific advisor to the Obama administration came out and said, no, we haven't. And, that was basically the short and sweet answer. But, see, I believe that, I'll go back to a theory of mine. I don't believe, or I'm beginning to believe that UFOs, might not be extraterrestrials. I actually believe that there's a good chance that they're time travelers from our future who have come back to see history as it's being made. And if you kind of get into the book and just from doing the research in this book for like 2 years, that's almost a better explanation than the quote-unquote little green men from Mars explanation. So what I would have worded, how I would have worded that petition is, I would have said, do you have any evidence that the U.S. government has been in contact with intelligent life forms other than human beings? I would like to see what the answer to that question is. Every UFO doesn't mean that they're little green men from Mars. They could be from anywhere, the future, inner space, another dimension, or whatever. But like I say, if you kind of look into it and see what UFOs were doing, especially during wartime, they just seem to be on hand observing us as we kill each other. It really does seem like there's a good possibility that they're time travelers coming back, to, like I said, to see history as it's being made.
Yeah, you and I agree on that, Mac. I said on the last time I hosted this show that my opinion on the UFO enigma is I think they're more than likely, I use higher dimensional, other dimensional travelers, parallel universe, because, it's sort of like now you see them, now you don't. I mean, if they were extraterrestrials, they would be in our atmosphere and they would stay there, I would think. But they're coming in and out of other dimensions, and that is evident in how they behave. They jump across radar screens, they appear, they disappear, they cause a lot of electromagnetic anomalies close by, and this is all consistent with even string theory and membrane theory, where scientists talk about these membrane universes being close by, probably just within inches of our universe, if you could use that measurement, and perhaps there are portals or places where these universes join, and that's where these beings or things come out. And also, as you stated, possibly time travelers. Jacques Vallée, a famous UFO author and geophysicist, that was his final conclusion, too, that he believes that UFOs are higher dimensional craft. But, yeah, like you say, maybe they should reword some of these petitions and try to put the government more on the spot. So, we agree on that. Having said that, doesn't mean that, extraterrestrials they could come here someday. As a matter of fact, the U.S. government has a contingency plan about that if they do come. And also, there's a book put out by FEMA. I can't recall the exact title of the book, but it's a firefighter's guide to disaster relief, and there's a whole chapter in there on recovery of extraterrestrial biological entities and extraterrestrial material, how it should be handled. So, anyhow, interesting subject, and we're kind of getting towards the tail end of the interview, but maybe at this point, Mac, is there anything else in the book that you'd like to talk about in the interview here that you think should be emphasized?
Well, the book is what it is. It's about 70 episodes, short episodes that we put together in a chronological order, mostly starting from the beginning of the 20th century and ending, like I say, right after the Gulf War. The idea was that we thought that if you read these from beginning to end, that just the sheer number of episodes that we were able to research in which UFOs seem to be on hand when we are either at war or preparing for war, that if by the time you get to the end of the book, that just by numbers alone, it would be almost impossible not to believe that UFOs exist. So, we think we did a pretty good job at that. A lot of people have told me that they like the book, but they also, people have given the book to people who are UFO skeptics and say that, this book can actually convince people who don't believe in UFOs that UFOs exist. So, UFOs exist, we just don't know what they are yet. And that's kind of like the core of what we're trying to get across in the book, is that, they exist, and so it's up to us, not the U.S. military, and certainly not the politicians, but the scientific community should get together and do a really good scientific, sober study on UFOs, and maybe at some point, hopefully in our lifetimes, we'll have an answer to this huge riddle of UFOs. I hope it happens in our lifetime. I got my fingers crossed it will.
Well, I got my fingers crossed too. I mean, there's so many agencies in the United States government that have UFO information. I mean,